you may be thinking, wouldn't it be cool to live in the Star Wars galaxy with all the spaceships, lightsabers, and the Force? Well, unfortunately, you're thinking wrong. It turns out, especially if you were born and living around the time of the main saga, there's almost nowhere you could live where life didn't turn out to be horrifying. And today we're going to be talking about some of the various atrocities that you would be living through, if you're lucky. So let's say you were born shortly before the Clone Wars, and we are going to be focusing on the Legends continuity, so let's go with around the time of the Phantom Menace. Even if you were still human, life was going to get pretty bad pretty fast. There's two ways to look at this. Maybe you live on a core world and you think you're going to be farther away from all the damage, or you might live in the Outer Rim and think because you're on such a small, out-of-the-way world, everything's going to pass you by. The impetus for Episode 1's events was the Trade Federation trying to blockade and then occupy Naboo. While Naboo may have been a step too far, the kinds of actions taken by the Trade Federation here weren't far off from what the Federation and other similar groups did on other planets throughout the Outer and even Mid-Rim. Most of the galaxy was oriented around extractive settlements made to serve the core, so the Trade Federation and similar corporate entities had pretty free reign in their attempts to make credits, and generally the Senate didn't care all that much. When you were far enough to be outside the authority of the Republic, and especially into Hutt territories, which were considerable at the time, practices like slavery were common, as we see with Anakin on Tatooine. Many species were also subject to constant invasions from other, more local powerhouses, an example of that being the species of General Grievous, the Kaleesh, something I've covered in more depth pretty recently. And on the opposite side of the galaxy, there were the Andoan Wars with Admiral Trench's species. When the Clone Wars themselves finally broke out, there wasn't really a safe place to be in the galaxy, and even the core started to face some of the devastation usually reserved for the Rim. Biological and chemical warfare was a common practice, or at least attempts at them were, with the CIS hoping to reignite the Blue Shadow virus, a plague which had recently stricken the galaxy before the Clone Wars, and they wanted to use it to take out the Jedi, knowing that their own droid forces would be immune. This particular attempt failed, but what followed in campaigns like Operation Dirge's Lance would devastate places long thought to be safe bastions. One of the opening moves of Dirge's Lance, orchestrated by General Grievous despite what the campaign's name may make you think, involves sieging the planet Duro and bringing down Jivus, one of its largest orbital cities. The bombardment which followed ruined the planet's surface. Duro had long been at least on the verge of complete environmental collapse, being the heavily industrialized home planet of the Duros and one of the founding members of the Republic. But while Coruscant had long been the clear center of galactic power, painting Duro as a rival, especially in the early days, wouldn't be that inaccurate, which hopefully gives an idea of how these events may have made others in the core feel, seeing a long-standing, long-safe core founder with such influence take such a beating. This was only the beginning, too, as another core founder soon became the target of Grievous. This time it was Humbareen. Humbareen was another city planet more in the vein of Coruscant itself, and its surface faced the same fate as Duro. The planet was razed by the CIS, forcing refugees to flee to other planets like Balmorra, which itself was a former colony world of Humbareen. Years later, the Imperials did maintain a presence on Humbareen, but it would never return to its former prominence as a major population center. From there, Grievous returned to biological warfare once again, releasing the brain rot virus on Lordovia. This killed not just every clone trooper on Lordovia, it killed almost every human on the planet and then spread to the entire Wemo sector, where it did the same thing, wiping out all clone troopers and almost all humans, leaving the whole sector quarantined and essentially uninhabitable for some time. This naturally isn't every atrocity of the Clone Wars, but it at least covers one of the instances where people who were otherwise not used to being at the center of the fighting were subjected to it in the same way as everyone else. Up to this point, they were typically able to spend their time liking this video and subscribing for more. But if you managed to survive the Clone Wars, the rule of the Empire would cover more or less your teens and 20s, and your experience here would again vary based on who you are and where you lived. For many in the core, the galaxy went back to being exploited for your benefit, But even on Coruscant, it's worth remembering that you're far more likely to be one of the less affluent people in the Undercity than the wealthier people on the upper levels, who primarily benefited from this arrangement. Generally, if you lived in the Star Wars galaxy, you didn't get to see much of the stars, you probably just stuck on your home planet. But things were significantly different on the Rim. The Empire did extend their authority more than the Republic had, cracking down on Hutt activities in some sectors, for example, but things like slavery were more nationalized than outlawed. Wookiees and Geonosians were forced into Imperial slavery working on mega projects like the Death Star. Other minor worlds like 8 and 2 had at least some population, but more importantly it had Stygium crystals that the Empire wanted to use for cloaking devices, and these were more easily mined by destroying the planet than by setting up an actual mining operation, so that's what they did. Even the core wasn't safe with the Death Star in play once it was time to make a political point. Alderaan was destroyed by Tarkin, hoping to make it a symbol cowing those who would resist. But as Grievous had learned in his rampage throughout the core in Operation Dirge's Lance, showing your enemies you're willing to go to these lengths doesn't really do much to win hearts and minds. And so another core world had fallen, this time into an entirely unrecoverable state. For those who protested against the Empire, even without necessarily joining the rebellion, you could have a shuttle landed on you, as happened at the Gorman Massacre, when Grand Moff Tarkin did just that. After Endor, the New Republic took the better part of a decade to gain control of most of the galaxy, and there was a revolving door of local regimes, with difficulties faced by the New Republic in re-establishing galactic trade routes, so resource shortages would have been a common occurrence. When Palpatine re-emerged in the Dark Empire campaigns, a mess of superweapons once again swept across the galaxy, destroying yet more planets entirely, including when the World Devastators nearly consumed Mon Calamari for resources. Refugees from Caecilius, another world which fell victim to Operation Dirge's Lance, had made their way to Biss in the deep core. Many of those refugees had then been used in dark-side experiments by Palpatine, at least until Palpatine and the planet itself were destroyed by another of those superweapons, the Galaxy Gun. This time, R2-D2 was at least partially responsible, adding to the droid's absolutely massive kill count. The Empire eventually ended up pushed just to the deep core and a small corner of the galaxy, only causing problems for the non-human species in a pretty heavily non-human set of sectors, considering we have some Moffs openly talk about hunting some sentient species, and clearly no aliens in the government, despite planets like Munilinst being a key part of their remaining territory. Munilinst, of course, being the homeworld of the formerly powerful Mun species, and other species like the Anks living in the region as well. But no matter how much the Clone Wars and Galactic Civil War ravaged the galaxy from your early years, in 25 ABY, so when you would be about 55 with our starting premise of your Phantom Menace era birth, an even more damaging war began, the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. The Vong were a race of technophobic, extragalactic invaders who wanted not to just control existing worlds and populations, but to enslave or eradicate them. For years, they had already been fomenting local unrest, as they did with the Osari and Ramamul conflict, and they'd even contributed to exacerbating parts of the Galactic Civil War. But this all went to another level during their own invasion. They quickly swept across the galaxy, subjecting planets to a process called Vong forming, where they shaped the environment to their own use, and implanted millions, if not billions, of the galaxy's denizens with slave coral, mind-controlling them. The opening salvo of the war at Cernpidal involved the evacuation of the planet as their moon was pulled down from orbit, killing any of the population which couldn't evacuate, including Chewbacca. This fate repeated across the galaxy, with not just planets but entire species being effectively wiped out. The Ferroans had already been nearly wiped out as a species and taken refuge on planets like Belderone, which was then targeted by the Yuuzhan Vong, turning the Ferroans into essentially an extinct species. Most of the population of Barab 1 was also taken and then killed when Jedi Master Sabbath Sabatine destroyed the slave ship holding them, not realizing what she was doing, although luckily many of her people had managed to hide while the collection was happening on Barab itself. The Avethans on Enzoth were entirely gone after the Vong invasion, and Duro, with its orbital cities, was ravaged even further, although the Vong forming did manage to remove the decades and centuries of pollution and the results of the orbital bombardment from Grievous. Ithor is another fairly prominent world and the homeworld of another common species in the galaxy, the Ithorians, which was raised by the Yuuzhan Vong, and probably most impactfully, Coruscant itself was targeted by the invaders. The actual density of Coruscant implies a population of several trillion, although in-universe references tend to just give 1 trillion as the estimate. Either way, there are a lot of people there, and when the Yuuzhan Vong began their assault on the world, they used a pretty reprehensible tactic. To bring down the shields of the planet, they used transports loaded with captives, ramming them into the shield and giving the New Republic the option of either taking down the shields to try to save the ships, letting the ships hit the shields, destroying themselves, or using their forces to destroy the ships before the ships could impact the shields. This represents an already massive atrocity against many other planets from which these populations were taken, but this only got worse as the shields were taken down and the assault on the planet itself began. The evacuation attempt would only succeed in saving a small fraction of the population, so for the next 2 years during the Yuuzhan Vong's occupation, much of the population was trapped in the lower levels of the planet, hiding from Vong hunting parties with varying amounts of success, and trying to avoid the effects of the Yuuzhan Vong's reshaping of the planet. The New Jedi Order series ends by saying the planet would be uninhabitable for a while, although the following series, Dark Nest, pretty quickly disregards this. Jacen Solo was able to use his friendship with the central control nexus of the world shaping, called the World Brain, to help mitigate some of the damage, but it was still considerable. Also, during the occupation, any of the supplies that Coruscant normally relied on would not have been able to be brought in. Even simple things like water treatment would not have been running while the Vong were there. By the time this war ended, you'd be about 60, and while there was a lot of rebuilding to do, there were 10 whole years following this without too many new atrocities. But on your 70th birthday, before you can blow out your space candles, you learn that a new war has broken out between Coruscant and Corellia, splitting the Galactic Alliance in two. The Yuuzhan Vong War would be hard to top, but the Second Galactic Civil War still gave it some good shots every now and then. In Legacy of the Force Inferno, Jacen Solo resorts to burning the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk. The Corellian Confederation and the Jedi were able to save the planet before it was completely burnt, but the devastation was still significant. All of this conflict in the galaxy was enough to free the Bringer of Chaos, Abeloth, a former servant turned semi-member of the Mortis gods who you may remember from the Clone Wars. For those able to remember the past paths of destruction across the galaxy that Abeloth had torn, like the Killiks, this posed a terrifying threat to civilization. Coruscant again fell prey to her as she caused massive earthquakes while trying to flee from the Jedi after taking over the Galactic Alliance government, though she was ultimately sealed away before she could wreak as much havoc as she typically might in her cyclical unleashing. So if all the wars weren't enough, there was always some eldritch horror hanging over your head. This is why you do not want to live in the Star Wars galaxy. Thank you for watching. Special thanks to all the patrons whose names you are seeing on the screen right now, and I hope to see you next time.